A life of duty, scandal, and sacrifice. Edward VIII was born to be king, the dashing and charismatic heir to the greatest empire the world had ever known. But when he ascended to the throne in 1936, his reign was destined to be the shortest in modern British history.
The Duke had succeeded his father, King George, on the throne of England until, in a speech beginning with the famous words, "At long last," he gave up his throne rather than give up marriage to Mrs. Simpson. It was a romance that rocked the empire, but it thrilled the world.
However, it was the unholy trinity, as I call them, of palace, parliament and church, who did not want Edward on the throne, and in my opinion, Mrs. Simpson became the suitable scapegoat for that. And there was this absolute rage and sense of revolt in the palace and partly in Parliament and certainly within the church.
We look into the life of the monarch who chose love over crown, detailing his complex relationship with American divorcee Wallis Simpson and the constitutional crisis that led to his stunning abdication. It's a story that reveals the man behind the title, a deeply personal struggle that changed the course of the monarchy forever. Born in 1894 as the oldest son of George, Duke of York, Edward became heir to the throne when his father was crowned King George V in May 1910 and was formally invested as Prince of Wales the following summer. As a young man, Edward emerged as one of the most popular members of the royal family. He had served in the Great War, albeit off the front lines, and took extensive tours of the Commonwealth on behalf of the Crown. He also embodied the persona of a handsome, charismatic prince and enjoyed the social and sexual spoils of his charmed existence.
Edward VIII was the fast-living prince. He was excited by change and innovation. As a man, he engaged in lots of outdoor pursuits, things like flying, golf, skiing, swimming. He was a real sort of showman in that respect.
Edward fulfilled his duties as a prince, as a young man, as the Prince of Wales, incredibly well. He was good-looking, he was charismatic, he was dashing. The people adored him.
As a dutiful son, he took time out to perform the necessary functions of the royal family, according to the wishes of his father. But even in those earlier years, he showed no great love for the upcoming office of ruling monarch. Shown here addressing Parliament not long before his death, felt sure that his son would outgrow this early unrest and be prepared to accept the responsibilities inherent in the high office of King of the British Isles.
The relationship between Edward and his father, George V, was particularly fraught. The two men did not see eye to eye. Edward had a very specific way of doing things. He wanted to do things differently.
In many ways, he was very spoilt, he was very indulged. He was the opposite of his father, who had duty inbred in every pore, whereas with Edward, duty was drilled into him, which he really resented.
George, on the other hand, was old-fashioned, backward-looking. He was always on his son's back as well, checking in on him, wanting to know and get updates as to what it was his son was doing. Edward didn't like this invasive behavior from his father, and the two fell out about it.
He wanted to be more spontaneous. He definitely was more modern. He went against the grain of his upbringing, the establishment, his background. But I would say also that he was very petulant, he was impulsive. When I think of Edward growing up, I actually feel incredibly sad for him, because I think he was a very sensitive boy who wanted his mother's love and really did love his mother to the end, but had total emotional neglect. There is this loneliness about him.
He knew that there was increased media attention, focusing on him, also what was going on in terms of his private life, and he knew he had a role to play that he was expected to perform.
Edward, as Prince of Wales, was a strange mixture of very good and very bad. He was very good in terms of giving good speeches, being charismatic, lighting up a party, always being the right person in the event. He was very bad because he had no actual investment in any of it. He often saw foreign trips as an opportunity simply to go and seduce local women.
He had lots of relationships, and they all tended to be with married women, which of course drove his family mad and raised concerned eyebrows at court.
Edward's relationship with his younger brother Bertie was very warm when they were younger boys. However, as the two men grew older, life became a bit more difficult. George had a very specific way that he wanted to live. He was much more of a kind of private figure. He was more withdrawn in terms of his public image. He didn't have the sort of the charisma and the glamour that was possessed by his older brother Edward. Character was marked by the fact that he didn't have a great deal of confidence. I think in that respect we can understand why later on he would be a more reluctant figure when it came to becoming king.
George VI was the opposite of his brother Edward growing up. He was Albert, he was known as Bertie. He was shy, he was retiring, while his brother was outgoing and gregarious. He had no particular interest in fashion, no particular interest in chasing after women, although his brother encouraged him in doing so. But as a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was, because he was somebody who didn't seem to be very comfortable around people.
The prince met Wallis Simpson at the House of Friends in early 1931. Only a few years after her divorce from US Navy pilot Earl Winfield Spencer, she had resettled in London with her second husband, maritime broker Ernest Simpson.
Wallis Simpson came from a very well-bred American family. She was very well educated. She went to a very good all-girls school, Oldfields in Baltimore, and she was very well read. She's very, very bright, Wallis.
While Wallis Simpson wasn't considered a standard beauty, she had a quick wit and an undeniable magnetism. And Edward became obsessed with this woman, who was unafraid to challenge his whims. On her end, here was the dashing Prince of Wales, the most eligible bachelor in the world, making her the center of his royal attention, and she was swept up in the romantic intrigue. By 1934, after the prince's regular mistress departed on an extended trip, Edward began foregoing the usual airs of secrecy regarding their relationship. They vacationed together that summer, without her husband, and the following year, Wallis began accompanying the prince to royal events.
It was well known in high society that this affair between Wallis and Edward had been going on. Over the course of 1936, the British government also increasingly came to learn about the relationship. However, it was hidden from the British public, and this is because the great press barons, Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, had conspired together to basically say to other Fleet Street editors of newspapers that they mustn't publish the story about Wallis and Edward, that this must be kept a closely guarded secret.
I think what was terribly difficult for the British public was, of course, they knew nothing about Wallis and Edward's relationship. They just saw their beloved king, with his flaxen hair going about his duties. Whereas within the establishment and within society, everybody knew about their relationship. Everybody in the Prince of Wales and Mrs. Simpson's circle who met Mrs. Simpson really liked her and really admired her and could see what a good influence she was on the king. However, it was the unholy trinity, as I call them, of palace, parliament and church who did not want Edward on the throne, and in my opinion, Mrs. Simpson became the suitable scapegoat for that. And there was this absolute rage and sense of revolt in the palace and partly in Parliament and certainly within the church.
King George V and Queen Mary were not happy with the presence of that woman, as Wallis was derisively known.
I think that the idea of a strong, confident woman who was forging her own path in the world was seen with absolute terror by people who didn't like the idea of this person who couldn't be kept down, wasn't answerable to anyone, didn't belong to the British codes of conduct.
But virtually everyone connected to the prince seemed to believe that his infatuation with the American would eventually pass, not grasping that he was determined to make her his wife.
There are a number of reasons why the British intelligence service were spying on Edward and Wallis. Wallis was rumoured to have had liaisons with foreign government officials.
The court was so desperately worried about the influence of this American woman, about whom they knew very little, on Edward. Well, people didn't know about who Wallis Simpson was. The country knew nothing because there was this press moratorium and they obviously weren't in the royal milieu. And those in the royal milieu, her friends, really liked her. They saw that she was witty, that she was warm, that she was fun, that she made the Prince of Wales happy. So I think there's a huge gulf between the woman Wallis was, the woman her friends knew, and then later public opinion.
There was a lot of pressure on Edward to either give up the throne in order to marry the woman he loved or give up Wallis Simpson. And that pressure came from, notably, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. There was also a lot of pressure coming from Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who advised both Baldwin and Edward that it would be very unbecoming for Edward to stay on the throne and marry this woman who was twice divorced.
On the evening of January 15th, 1936, King George V took to his bedroom at Sandringham House, complaining of a cold. He remained in the room until his death. He became gradually weaker, drifting in and out of consciousness. King George V died on January 20th, 1936, and Edward ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. The next day, accompanied by Wallis Simpson, he broke with custom by watching the proclamation of his own accession from a window of St. James's Palace.
Liege Lord Edward VIII. God save the King.
Well, when his father died, he greeted his father's death with absolute hysteria, and he was throwing things around and shouting and unable to respond to it. And I think a lot of people thought this was a very bad omen of what was to come, and they were proved right.
As feared by royal aides, Edward showed little interest in any sort of day-to-day governorship. He was mainly preoccupied with marrying Wallis Simpson, and from her husband at least, there was no pushback, as the businessman agreed to let the king have his way. The new king proved popular with his subjects, and his coronation was scheduled for May 1937.
As a king, Edward took his role quite seriously, certainly when it came to being out and about in amongst his subjects. When he'd been Prince of Wales, Edward was very active, going out into villages, towns, cities, meeting, greeting ordinary working class people. There was a great deal of affection for him among the British public because he had this special intimate relationship with them. However, in terms of the business of government, he was less dutiful.
His affair with Mrs. Simpson was reported in American and continental European newspapers, but due to a gentleman's agreement between the British press and the government, the affair was kept out of British newspapers. Convincing the Church of England and the rest of the government was another story. The Church would not marry a divorcee with a living ex-husband, let alone two, and while the king could seek a civil ceremony, the act would place him at odds with his standing as head of the Church. Around the time Wallis Simpson was granted a preliminary divorce in October 1936, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin finally confronted Edward about the severity of the situation. Over several meetings, he expressed his belief that the Edward-Wallis marriage would not be supported by the government or the British people, and explained why Parliament, as representative of the people, could determine who was suitable to be queen.
There was definitely pressure for him to abdicate from Stanley Baldwin. I mean, Stanley Baldwin saw this as, you know, an event to rejoice over, I think, despite all that was said. I mean, he was the ultimate snake in the whole system. It was an absolutely torrid time in that there were all these powerful factions who were determined to have their influence and sway.
Edward proposed a morganatic marriage in which Wallis would not receive a royal title, but this was rejected. So too was Edward's request to make his case to his subjects by way of a radio address. The next day, the scandal broke on the front pages of British newspapers.
The public's reaction to the announcement of this news of the affair was one of shock and surprise. How could this news have been kept from them for so long?
They adored this man, they put their faith in him, they all wanted him to marry, and such was the public's affection for Edward that in fact there were many discussions, especially with Wallis, well, could he give an address to the people? And if the people could understand that he loved this woman and he genuinely felt he could not be a good king without her, then they would understand.
They were, in some quarters, supportive of their king. They thought that he should be able to marry the woman he loved and stay on the throne. However, certainly in more middle class and in more conservative circles, there were concerns that Edward was not putting duty ahead of his personal gratification.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman, indeed a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough, that they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne. So it really split the country down the middle, and of course the upper classes were faced with this completely different idea, whereby they didn't condemn him from a moral perspective, they condemned him more from a perspective of being selfish enough to having put the country in this constitutional crisis.
Edward always knew that abdication was a possibility. If we go and look at the diaries of his friends and associates earlier on in 1936, when they're talking about the affair before it's become public news, we know that Edward was already considering this idea that he might have to abdicate in order to marry the woman he loved. However, this was not plan A. He would have preferred to stay as king. This was a role he cared about deeply, that he wanted to play, and he wanted to marry the woman he loved. Ultimately, he was pushed towards option B, which was ultimately giving up the throne in order to marry Wallis.
It's a really interesting question, was the abdication a difficult decision for Edward? Because in one sense it wasn't a difficult decision at all, because the thing that he was most clear about was that he could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved, and that this relationship meant more to him than anything. However, for a man like that who'd been brought up in that household, obviously to abdicate was the most seismic, devastating event. And I think he genuinely felt terrible at letting the people who loved him down.
But at long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything. But until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all, God save the king.
With no path for compromise, Edward informed Stanley Baldwin on December 5th that he would abdicate. A bill was introduced in the House of Commons on December 10th, and 2 days later, the Declaration of Abdication Act went into effect, formally freeing the former king of the heavy burden he spoke of.
Edward wanted to abdicate. He hated being king. It was one of the things he found easiest in his life. The problem is that what he found and what the people around him found was you can't simply unilaterally abdicate. It isn't as easy as just saying, I don't want to be king anymore and stopping being king, because it's not a job. It's a whole responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the nation. And so while I think he would have given up being king immediately, it wasn't in his power. And so what you can see is that there was this enormous chicanery that came into play that was essentially designed not just to allow him to abdicate, but also to maintain the institution of the monarchy, because there was a genuine fear in December 1936 that Edward could have brought down the entire monarchy with him, because there were rumours at one point he was just going to flee the country with Wallis, and that'd be that.
At 1:52 p.m. on Friday, the 11th of December, that dreadful day, in the phrase of the new king, Britain witnessed her third sovereign in 11 months. Prince Albert, Duke of York, was now King George VI.
Well, what happened immediately after the abdication was that it was decided that Edward could not remain in Britain any longer, because it was felt that having an ex-king in his own country created a situation that was both rife with constitutional issues, but it was also difficult from a perspective of how he would be regarded, because there was always a fear of Edward having a kind of rival court, because there was such public sympathy towards him.
He left the country a few hours later, ending a 325-day reign that brought the storied British monarchy to a crossroads. Edward and Wallis moved to France. Essentially, however, they were exiled. He was stripped of his Royal Highness status and demoted to the Duke of Windsor. They could not return home without the permission of his brother, the new King George VI, for fears it could cause public unrest. To keep him in line, the government threatened to suspend payments from his financial settlement. A constitutional crisis was avoided, and the ex-king was now free to marry as he wanted.
"25 years ago, the romance of the century reached full flower at a castle in Mons, France. There, the king who abdicated his throne married the woman he loved. The Duke of Windsor and Mrs. Wallis Simpson, the king and the commoner, became man and wife.
On June 3rd, 1937, Edward and Simpson were married at the Château de Condé in France's Loire Valley by the one royal chaplain who agreed to perform the service.
The wedding day was a bittersweet affair. Prior to the wedding, Edward had been delivered two visceral blows. One, he was told that his wife would never get the HRH title, Her Royal Highness, and it is no exaggeration to say that he received this news like a sort of fatal gunshot wound from which he never, ever recovered. And the second was to be told that no member of his family would be attending the wedding. The wedding was actually quite a sad affair, and they only had 12 guests, and those that were present could see that this was a massive come down for the former King of England.
Now known as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward and Simpson spent much of their remaining years in France, at odds with the British royal family.
Well, was this a great love affair or was it a tragedy? And my answer would be both. Towards the end of their life, the more it became us against the rest of the world, it then became a genuine love affair, and they relied on each other. And what I think is so touching is that towards the end of his life, Edward said that he did not have one breath of regret about what had happened, because every day he was so happy to be with Wallis.